Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, December 8th of 2020. We're two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday, and this Sunday is December 13th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B, and we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person for the week shares some questions, and then we share with each other, encourage, and we challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sara Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And for this third Sunday of Advent, we're going to be reading John 1, 6 through 8, and then jumping to verses 19 through 28. And we'll all be participating in this reading. So I'll kick it off with verses 6, 7, and 8, and then we'll leap with Bill's reading to verse 19. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light.
This is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" John confessed and did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No."
And then they said to him, "Who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." And now they had been sent from the Pharisees.
They asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal." This took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing.
And that's the word of the Lord. And thank you for watching, for joining in this discussion today, and we hope to hear from you as you discover new things in your journey. I've got 3 questions for the team today, and the first one coming your way, Bill Hull, and it's about the no. The second question will be about the yeses, but the first is about the no, and why the recurring decisive intensity of John's no, the "I am not" from John. Bill?
Yes, thank you, Don. Thank you for all of your questions. Very thought-provoking. I'll begin briefly by reminding myself and us that we look at this passage through our lenses of today. We have no choice but to do that. We are who we are, which gets at, I think, your question. So I say that because having had a modicum of training in college and seminary on psychology and counseling, this term self-definition, I don't know when it originated, but I think it's a somewhat modern term. But the insights of psychology that remind us it's important to know who I am and who I am not, and what I am and what I am not. And for example, we're using 2 parts of chapter 1, preceded by the famous prologue of John, in the beginning was the Word. And we're very quickly introduced in, verse 3, the light of the people, that this has to do with light. And John says, I am not the light, or it is said of John, I am not the light. So that a part of knowing ourselves is the not. And you're starting with the not. I think that's important. And we're signaling the next question is the yes. So John, it's said that he's not the light. He says of himself, he's not the Messiah, he's not Elijah, he's not the prophet. And then in verse 27, he says, I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandals. What I believe from modern psychology is that and none of us see ourselves perfectly. Okay, we can move in the direction of self-awareness. It frees us to be who we really are rather than struggling to be someone we are not. One of the things I dealt with in counseling were people who were, in effect, programmed by their parents or someone, you've got to be this, or you've got to follow in your father's footsteps and be a minister or a lawyer or whatever. And that how enslaving is a strong word, certainly limiting and shackling it was to be somehow programmed to be something you're not by nature or intelligence or whatever. And, you know, in verse 22, they ask, then who are you? And his definition is, I'm a voice, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. So that John, and we're not told how he came to this awareness. How did he know that Jesus was the Messiah? We're not told. I personally think it's more powerful. We're not told. We're not given all the details of these. If my memory is correct, John and Jesus were 6 months apart in birth. Their mothers were, am I right, cousins? I think they were somehow related. Very likely, at least by storytelling, John and Jesus had some awareness of their birth, both births of which were unusual, one to a woman too old to be carrying a child, one not supposed to be, too young and unmarried. And as we know, in the 14th verse of John 1 is this famous phrase, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And it seems to me that John very quickly in his gospel is lifting up both the divinity of Christ and the humanity of Christ. Humanity, Word become flesh, and John saying he is the Messiah. So here in the early verses, we have, yes, who John is not, but we have a beginning clear definition of that Jesus was truly human and truly divine. And we know that John alone records the I am affirmations that come from Jesus or about Jesus. And John's I am is, I am a voice crying in the wilderness. And it had not struck me until this time, and I don't know how much I want to make of this, Jesus does not speak until verse 38 of this chapter. Until then, it's John's voice, the interrogators' voices, so that the first human voice we hear is that of John, and then it, of course, transitions to Jesus. So to sum up, Don, I think the not is very important. We say it's negative, but knowing our strengths and weaknesses, knowing at least in part what our calling is very helpful, and I would even say very necessary.
Thank you. How about you, Sarah? What do you think about the no's?
Well, I think that fame has found John. His work and his preaching have drawn the eye and the interest of those who are powerful. I think they come ready to investigate the work that he is about in an effort to discredit. So they are on the hunt, if you will, the look, They are on the inquiry path for the Messiah, not to learn more about God's purposes, but to debunk the Messiah. So here's John, and they approach him with that, as Mark Davis would imply, an interrogative, or as interrogating as they can, and they approach John and they go, "Hey, you're sounding a lot like the Messiah. Are you the Messiah?" And so I think it's really wonderful, like you have led us to think about, that John has really good clarity about who he is and his place, his role, his part in the story. So he states it's not about him. The message is not him. He speaks to the one that's coming after him. He's merely testifying to what he knows. He's testifying to the inbreaking of God, to the incarnation of Christ. I really, when I read this week's DearWorkingPreacher.org and Rolf Jacobson, his blog, or his pericope, or whatever we're going to call it, he suggests that John is a model of who we are and who we can be in Advent, and it speaks to how we move through the season as individuals. We are not the fixer. We are not the Savior. We are not the expression of God in God's wholeness. We are merely somebody that can bear witness to it and speak to what we understand and what we see. So I think it's really interesting how John proclaims the coming of the Christ. I think that we could be a part of that story in the same way, proclaiming the tender and deliberate and good work of God, pointing to it and encouraging others to see it for themselves. I think that's what John's role is. John recognizes that he's only a flashlight, and not the main scene, not the show, not the expression of God in this place and time. So I found that very comforting, because I'm more comfortable being a flashlight than I am anything else. So it's easy to look for the expressions of God in the world around me and go, I see it. Did you see that? I see that. And let that be the way I interact with the processes that God is about. So that's my no, I am not comment on John.
Well, I was thinking about clearing the way, making the way straight for Jesus, and I think being sure you say no is as powerful as doing the yes in that kind of road work that you're building. And this human capacity to create character, I think you both are kind of addressing that our imaginations are very powerful, godlike in a way, demigod-like in terms of what we can imagine onto someone or onto ourselves. And we deal with that even today with mass media and propaganda and things like that. It's just so easy to fill up an empty vessel. And if you don't know John, if you only hear about John, or if he does specific things, you can turn him into an empty vessel and create anything you want. And that takes a lot of work. Mind, power, and imagination gone astray. All that time and all that thinking and all that imagination to create something that isn't true. And I think that's where the no comes in, to kind of cut that off and get us back into what John is really doing. He is a blocker on the road work for Jesus if he doesn't clear this up. He's got to clear it up. It's part of being the road builder that he's supposed to be doing. He's got to say no because of human beings and our imagination gone wild on trying to figure out who are you. And if there have been others that seem to be like the baptizer, if you're listening about what he's done, you haven't been there, there's probably been other baptizers and other people in the wilderness, and it's pretty easy to connect him with other people. Oh, he's like this, he's like that. And so the no's really play into that as well. Jesus has to do that too in his ministry. He steps out of the way of all that. He doesn't have to defend himself or engage anymore in the conversation because he says no. I think part of that is our desire to add somebody up or fill the empty vessel. I call it a brand vacuum in the work I do. You have a brand vacuum, somebody's going to fill that up for you. You've got to say no. And it seems to me it's important that it's not evasive. And if not for no, there's a problem. There's a bigger problem. So it's very powerful. And the no also is connected to people having to come and see it. You can't say no if you're not face to face. So as far as he's concerned, I'm stretching my interpretation a bit, is the more the better. Whether they're with him or against him, whether they are coming to repent or not, whether they're seeking or not, whether they're political or not, whether he's being tested or not, the more he can get face to face, the better, because it's easier for him to say no face to face than from a distance. It's not possible. So it's not evasive, and it stops speculation in its tracks. Well, Charles, how about you? Before we move to the next question, which is a yes question, any thoughts from you?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, Don. I'm the truth is that we don't know what John was thinking. Either John who was writing the gospel that we're now reading, or the John about whom he is now writing, who is the actor, the player, the figure in the story. We don't know what they were thinking. We don't know that. The best we can do is to say, what might account for this turning out the way it does. Here's a gospel which John, the gospel writer, starts out with this incredible declaration of the good news. Not the good news that Jesus preached, but the good news that Jesus was. That's the difference between the Jesus of John's gospel and the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're talking about the good news about Jesus, and in John's gospel, the good news is Jesus. That's I am. That's the way he does that. So the best we can do is to say, okay, given some of these, and as far as we can tell, the Gospel of John was the last of the four written. It's not just the last in the set that we have when we open our Bibles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's there, and it's also, as far as we can tell, it was the last one to have been put to paper. It's different from the other three, dramatically and radically different in so many ways, and so we have to be careful to avoid simply washing over what we're now reading with the Mark or the Luke that we've come from and the Mark that we're about to get into by having to remind ourselves this is different. This is different. And so one of the suggestions I read, which I hadn't, and I can't remember to whom to attribute this at this point, I apologize. But it's not my idea. Is that John was facing in his audience, in the people to whom his gospel was addressed, there were still persons there who had come in originally and still bore substantial allegiance to John the Baptizer. And so this is imagination, but it explains why in a gospel that starts out with this powerful proclamation of the I am in Jesus, why he sort of steps aside and has this, strong negative statement by John the Baptizer. And the speculation was that was in order to make it clear to those who clung to John as originator and the source, to say this is what John himself had to say about his own relationship to the Messiah. Here it is. No, no, no. Not me. Look ahead. Not me. Look to what's coming. Not my words. Listen to his. He's the one that that I'm sent to prepare the way for, but I'm not worthy of even untying his sandals. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking, Bill Hull, that you could almost structure a discussion group or a Bible study around just analyzing the no's to which they are attached and the intent, the purpose of doing that. It could be a pretty rich discussion. And now I'm tempted to say, well, you could also bookend that with a stray no. Aren't you one of his disciples? Absolutely not. No. Weren't you with him in the garden? I am not that man. No. No. That's a bookend, almost at the end of John, same book. But let's go to the yeses, the power of the yeses. So here's the question. It's coming at you, Sarah. If you look at the positive responses, you consider the author of John's affirmative. He came as a witness to testify to the light. And John's personal I am the voice in verse 23. After all these decisive recurring intensity of the no's, shouldn't we understand what the affirmatives actually mean? What are your perspectives on these two kinds of affirmatives that the authors put out in John, Sarah?
Well, I think it's lovely that you painted a picture of John as a blocker in the art of road building. So is John like a profiler that surfaces the road in preparation for the vehicle that's coming, or the traffic, or the future that's about to unfold? I'm really delighted to think about John as an action, as a deliberate movement to set the scene, to prepare the way. I'm thinking about, what does it look like to prepare for company? And the fine art of setting the table, cleaning the house, making sure that as much that can be readied ahead of time is ready ahead of time. My mom used to speak to this as, this is how, when your company walks in, and she taught me, people observe how you've prepared for their arrival. And if you've gone to a lot of trouble, it speaks to how you feel about them. If you haven't gone to any trouble, I'm not sure that always speaks about how you feel about somebody, but it certainly can give honor to them if you've taken the efforts to clean the home, to prepare the table, to prepare the food, to make sure coffee is on, and the soup is ready. So I think that what we're hearing about John's yeses is John says, my job is to make sure the soup is ready. My job is to make sure that your heart is ready. My job is to make sure that you are looking in the right direction when the Messiah comes. And I think about how, for so many of us, we live in the world where the Spirit works on our hearts and shifts our thinking and reminds us of things at particularly perfect times. And in that role, the Spirit acts as the one who prepares the way. So I'm thinking about John being the person that said, yes, I'm going to do these things. Yes, I'm committed to this. Yes, this is my part, and I want to play it. It may have been as the son of Zechariah, who was struck dumb during the pregnancy. John's arrival onto the world as a herald, as a person to say, wait till you see what's coming. Wait till you understand the gift that's being given. So I think that John and his father, Zechariah, are modeling, or if you will, are giving us an idea of John's place and time and purpose. So I'm wondering how often we say yes to being just the witness. It's so tempting from a human perspective to feel like we've played a part. It's our doing that makes it happen. Suddenly we were brilliant and we had the forethought or the wonderful cognitive awareness that I should bring these two wonderful people together. Wait till you see the magic that's going to occur. It'll be like Pixar. it'll be that sense of our part in it. And John goes, I know my part. And this is my part, and I'm happy to do it. And I think there's something to be said for that. So I guess my question is now returning, how might our actions be a living witness to the coming Christ? What are we affirming? Tag Bill.
Okay, so I'm on. We bypassed Don.
That was a very direct pass.
I think the voice of authority just spoke. I'm going to begin my response to this question echoing what I said at the beginning of question 1's response. We have no choice but to look at this through the lens of today, acknowledging that those lenses may be distorted, and in some ways are. But I think we have to take the risk of seeking to understand what might have been meant then and what it means now. Okay, so having said that, I was highly influenced at one point in my life by being given a copy of and reading and devouring Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Needless to say, it caught my attention when some years later he wrote Habit 8. And I was given a copy of that. And as you may know, what impelled him before his tragic death to say, I left something out. Habit 8 is, find your own voice and inspire others to find their voices also. Now that sounds very simple, maybe even simplistic, but taking the profound sense in which Stephen Covey talks about finding your voice, it has nothing to do with yelling to make yourself somehow prominent. It again goes back to self-awareness. What is that within me that I want to give expression to, and let me help others to find their voices also and express what's deep within them. Now, it is said of John, and Don, back to your question 2, is the affirmation. He was not the light, it is said, but he was called to testify to the light. He says of himself, I am a voice crying in the wilderness. And it strikes me that's about seeing and speaking. Okay, light enables us to see, and speaking enables us to take what is within and somehow offer it externally. And we know that using today's terminology, John the Baptist lost his life because he spoke truth to power, challenging Herod's public immorality. It led to that bizarre story of the beheading of John, and that it was done for the worst of reasons, to preserve Herod's public image at a party. And I think also, Don, of Jesus, I believe it's Jesus who is quoted as saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Speaking our truth is not always easy, especially when we anticipate it is going to meet with great resistance. And I look upon John, on the one hand, as bizarre. His diet, his clothing, he's hanging out in the wilderness. We're not told that John went about as Jesus did from north to south. It's based on what I think we know. He stays in the wilderness. But I look upon him as a kind of model for, again, knowing who I'm not, knowing who I am, my yes, and speaking that clearly. John spoke very clearly without wrapping it in wiggle words or evasiveness, very directly speaking truth to power, which I think is a whole other subject about how the church today needs to speak truth to power. I don't have this all wrapped up, Don, but that's what's on my mind at the moment as a response to question 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I've been taking notes of your comments, and it brought me to think about how personal all this is. Over the years I've read this, what pops into my head mostly, other than the wild man, is the crowd, the intensity, lots of people, just front and center. But this is so personal, too. And I think about last week when we dealt with John and Mark, and or maybe it was the week, but I think it was last week, and we talked about the emptiness, and it's filled up with people, and that the city is impersonal, but that the wilderness is personal because it talks about repentance and baptism. And it feels so individual, even though there's so many people there. And so I think there might be a connection between the yes and the personal, for the personal to work through it. And the reason I'm thinking about that is when I practiced law, I didn't try many cases, but one thing I learned was you put a witness in front of somebody, the rules of evidence, the rules of testimony don't really establish that the jury or any listener is actually going to believe anything. It's really making it personal. And the no's and the yeses really matter, especially affirmatives really matter. But you have to make it personal. You have to see it. And I've been wondering if part of the witness and the yes of this is in the witnessing going on by the people who are going out to see Jesus. Let's say the ones who are going out to check him out, the ones who are there to interrogate him, that it's all the same. And what is your personal experience when you're going to seek? Even if it's for political purposes. What are you going to get caught up in? And so I was imagining the people interrogating him coming back, and they're not going to say, what's your conclusion? To establish first that they could see it, feel it, touch it, taste it, whatever it is they went to see. Were you really there? It would be, did you go where he was? Yes or no? Yes, we did. We went to where John was. Good. Did you see him? Yes, we did. They kind of overlay the gospel on this. Right? We're always asking ourselves this. Can you describe him? Are you close enough to say what he looked like? Yes, I was. Did you speak with him? Yes. Can you describe the people around him? Yes, I can. Yes, I can. I can do all these things. And I think I haven't until this week thought about the interesting dynamic of those who are going out to him no matter what and their role as a witness as he does the affirmative yes. And how personal this is that they're coming out just to see him, be bad. Just a kind of a new thing that I'm working on that makes it very personal. And part of the personal carries into the last question too. But first, Charles, let me go to you to see if you have any comments on the affirmative.
That was a no.
And we have the negative from Charles Willard. Thank you. So the last question, and I'll just bring it up again and read it to you, is about baptism. Why does baptizing appear to be the gateway or triggering behavior for all these inquiries and challenges and concerns when it comes to John and his identity? I might be wrong about that, but it seems like that's one of the acts, or the key act, that's drawing out people to interrogate him. And can we really understand what those concerns are, if that's accurate, in the 21st century, that baptism would be a triggering event for concern and analyzing who this person is? And I'll just kick it off, and then, Bill, I'll go to you. Is the reason I asked that was through this lens of witnessing and something personal. Can I read into why baptism is a trigger? I mean, there's an understanding in the community that baptizing has a shape to it. It is a thing. It is regulatable, too, which means he could be out of step with that. But I'm wondering if it's the personal that makes it especially an important trigger, that we understand that as something that people engage in in terms of turning around, in terms of being repentant. That it's not the crowd. The crowds are secondary. The fact is that people are intentional about what they're doing. They're not just going to witness. There's another affirmative taking place, which is an affair of the heart, and that is the trigger. And that I can, in the 21st century, only understand what baptism really means as a trigger 2,000 years ago if I go, oh, it's personal. Yes, there are crowds, but it's getting really personal. And there are lots of witnesses, and we need to ask him, in the negative and the affirmative, what he really intends to do. Something like that. Not you, Bill. Baptism is a trigger. Can we understand it?
Great question. As I understand it, and I don't think this is apocryphal, scholars I trust say this, in the early days of the Christian movement, certainly it appears that baptism was by what we now call immersion, being baptized in the river Jordan. We're not given the mechanics of it. And as a lifelong Presbyterian, I grew up hearing, and I assume it's still the standard of the Presbyterian Church, that the mode of baptism does not determine its efficaciousness, to use a nice big fancy word, and that we as Presbyterians accept baptism by any mode, and that in fact, as an ordained minister, I can baptize by any mode, and I'll say something more about that in a moment. Don, what I've heard is that in the early days of the Christian faith, soldiers who became Christians, understanding the rejection of violence, when they were baptized, would hold their sword up above so that it did not go in the water, an acknowledgement that a part of them was not being baptized. Now, whether that's accurate or not, it illustrates the potential power of baptism by immersion. Now, a personal story. I had always baptized people by sprinkling. After I retired, having said I would never do an interim, I've done, 2 or 3 now. The first one was a local in Bradenton Disciples of Christ congregation whose pastor had taken another call, and I was asked to fill in for a few weeks. And 5 years later, I resigned as the interim. Their mode of baptism is by immersion. And so you know where this story is going. Out of respect for their tradition, I did a number of baptisms by immersion. And before the first one, I got a good friend, a retired Baptist minister, to come to the church and actually let me practice doing that. Now, again, I will affirm the mode of baptism does not determine the legitimacy. I will tell you that my observation was there's a very different experience of baptism when it's done by immersion. It takes a lot of trust, okay? Not to get too far in the weeds, but here I am cradling this person's head. There's a way they clasp my hand, and I lowered them under the water and back up. And I would talk with people beforehand. And in several cases, the person panicked here in public worship in front of everybody, and I would bring them up and reassure them. That idea of dying to sin and rising to newness of life. Now, I'm not advocating we go to that. That's not where I'm going. I will tell you that I initially did it out of respect for their tradition. Of course I did that. I respected their tradition and their expectations. But I came to see, it wasn't magical, but there was a power in surrendering of control. because they had to depend on me to do this graciously, quickly. Now, I don't want to stay too long with this, but just telling this story, each time I did one of those baptisms, it was a powerful reminder, I think, of the gospel. Jesus is the statement in Philippians of emptying himself, taking on the form of a servant, surrendering. That was a powerful experience. Now, however we do baptism, back to your question, why is it a gateway? I think that's why it's a gateway. It's an acknowledgement that salvation comes from outside of myself. Salvation is a gift. As Sara said earlier, I am not the Messiah. I am not the great physician. I am not the good shepherd. Like John, I am to point to someone else. My job is not to be the model, but to point to the one that we are to follow. That's where I am at the moment, Don.
Thank you. Sara, I was, one of the things I just wrote down was Bill used the term practicing baptism. And I am excited by those. That is a loaded, wonderful 2 words put together. Even the word practicing can be used in so many ways. I just want to tell you, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to have a lot of fun with the term practicing baptism this week. Sara, what do you think about this as a trigger for investigating John?
You know, I wonder, aside from the message that John was bringing, he's leveraging something that's familiar, right? So they had the pools that you would wash your body in to present yourself to the priests for adjudication to see if you were healed. They had the pools or the barrels of water to wash yourself in before you came into the temple. So there's, in my mind, I wonder, and Charles, you're going to be the one that tells me yes or no to this, I suspect that it was in the memory, the living memory, the practice, the behavior of the Jewish people to walk through the mental processes and the physical processes of washing before they went into temple, to cleanse their hands, to cleanse their person from their daily activity. And so there's this interesting contrast between clean and unclean that's playing out even if it's not spoken about. So maybe John's use of this water, taking it away from the constrained container and putting it back where it started into the river, is a different kind of idea. And I'm wondering about that, because it becomes a deliberate choice and not a behavioral memory that we're just practicing so that we can go into temple. And it's also breaking open this notion that the temple is no longer a physical building, it's a process or it's a place, it's a particular idea that you can be with God everywhere and not just in a physical building. So with those kind of backdrop items, I will say, standing in front of that is John washing. You know, he's talking about, he looks, if I had to say it, he would probably be an unusually interesting person. He's wild. He dresses with more of ascetic practice, so it's going to be animal fur and a belt, and he eats locusts and wild honey, and he's much more a man off the land than the refined priest that we will see in the sanctuary in Jerusalem. So I'm thinking about, how does that refresh? If we're going to shake the Etch-a-Sketch about where you go to meet God, John is certainly a shake and Etch-a-Sketch. So perhaps what John is doing is forcing a question. Or what does his baptism and our baptism prepare one for? Are we entering a new kingdom? If you're going to wash before you go into the temple, what is the wash that John is doing, preparing us for, is my question. Are we ridding ourselves from the notion of clean and unclean? Are we ridding ourselves of the notion of we are unheard, we are marginal, we are a throwaway to the true story that's happening? Is it a throwing away of our idea of unworthiness? Is it a symbolic action to reposition our hearts for service? And I'm thinking about that. And so the phrase that I'm working for from this perspective is that baptism is a preparation for something. What is it a preparation for? And I remember I think we use this language when we baptize in our congregation, that it's an outward expression of an inward action. That it's something we can see that represents something we cannot. And that I loved the idea of the laying back and the bringing up that you gave us, Bill, because I think there is something said about surrendering in baptism, acknowledging that I am only a flashlight and I am not the main act, if you will. I think that's really important, but I think it's because we are called to do something with that. It's not just washing your hands. It's washing your hands because you're going to you're going to prepare food. You're going to meet somebody new for the first time. It's preparation for something more. And my question would be, to what end? Toward what are we moving and why? Can we explain why we are doing these things? And what can we testify to? So I think that's what John, and I love that the author John brings John into the story, because I think that, again, is to push toward the idea is, who do we see taking actions today who are witnessing to the good work of God? Nurses, doctors, people who give encouragement to each other, pastors on Zooms. You know, it's amazing to me every week when we get filled up again via Zoom by the pastors at our congregation, because it's words that we need. Thank you, John. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Will. I just am so encouraged. You know, I got a wonderful thank you note from Allison. It just made my heart leap. And I was just like, what a gift to give somebody, to open an envelope and get a sweet note that said thank you to me for doing something. So it was kind. I think that's what we're called to look for and take action on, and maybe that's what our baptism prepared us for. So maybe that's what is so phenomenally different about John's baptism.
Thank you, Sarah. And for clarification, if you're a millennial or a Gen Z listener, an Etch-a-Sketch is a mid-20th century child's toy that enables a child to draw pictures and erase them over and over again. For Gen X, we still blame you for breaking the Etch-a-Sketch. Charles, it's yours to wrap up.
It's a strange kind of a wrap-up, so it's not really a wrap-up. It's more like an unraveling. And that is that I, as far as I can tell, and I did not go back and do some more work covering ground that I covered some years ago. As far as I can tell from my memory, baptism was a new thing. Baptism was not something that was practiced in the Jewish tradition up to that point. So that when the Israelites were in the desert, they weren't being baptized. Their children were not being baptized. It was something, there was a phenomenon that occurred right in the early or late BCs and the early 80s, and to which John was then taking hold and using. But again, I think if our question is, why is John the Baptizer present in this gospel, in this place, in this time? It is to declare to those who have been inclined to think of themselves as disciples of John to listen to what John said, in which he was not pointing at himself, but he was pointing ahead to one who was to come, and that the gospel of John is about the one who is to come and is now here, present, speaking to you right now, or at least he was then, and now I'm reporting what that happened, or what happened, at least in my view of it.
Well, thank you, Charles. And I see that we are out of time. And it's been a great journey. And for those listening in, Palma Sia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening or watching during the time of the pandemic, we commend that site to you for other resources. Other discussions of the Gospel Lectionary for Sundays, reflections, sermons, meditations, conversations, and great music. So check that out for all those resources. And if you have insights or comments for us you want to share with this team, we have an email, which is lectionarycallin@palmacia.org. Lectionarycallin@palmacia.org. And we look forward to hearing from you. And you're always welcome. And we'll see you next time.